Hi everyone. This is my lecture for week um, 13 in our class, History 207, the history of the Silk Road in China. And I'm creating this lecture because I'm unable to be in class for the next 2 weeks. So on Tuesdays, when we normally have lecture, I will have these recorded lectures posted for you to view. Um, for this week, we also have a film that would have been shown on Thursday, and the film is available through the module for this week's course material. So please take a look at that, as well as read the chapter from Southeast Asia in the World that I copied and posted to Canvas for you. Craig Lockhart's chapter. Start on page 63. That's about where the material that covers the spice trade begins. The island Southeast Asia portion of the chapter is what's most important in this case. So we're looking here at the modern map of Indonesia, and sort of the other map here on the side of the slide shows you where Indonesia is located. Here south of China, south of mainland Southeast Asia, which is here. Island Southeast Asia is what we're talking about here, this part of the spice trade. So we're looking at that same map that I've shown in class before. Remember, all the spice islands are located over here where cloves were native, and down here in the Banda Islands where nutmeg and spice could be found. So I want you to take a look at that map, because this is the area that we'll be talking about in today's lecture. The trade across the Indian Ocean is the kind of the site of what we were talking about in terms of spice trade routes. So this is the Indian Ocean, a very broad expanse of water, but the coastline of this area contains all the different places we've talked about in the class, including the Arabian Peninsula over to the left, up in the corner, the Indian subcontinent, where traders from the Persian Gulf and even the Mediterranean landed in very early times and traded back and forth across this section of the Indian Ocean. And on the east side of the Indian subcontinent were major maritime empires formed, and they traded with Southeast Asian islands and all the way up until China. So for a while, there's sort of a dividing line is really the Indian subcontinent. It's the dividing line between the eastern portion of the Indian Ocean trade network and the western portion of the Indian Ocean trade network. But as we saw in the film last week on Zheng He's voyages during the 15th century, traders passed all the way across. It was possible to pass all the way across that entire region from China all the way over to Africa and to be involved in the trade over there. Before Zheng He's time, and going back to that earlier period of Indian Ocean trade, the traders were mostly traveling along the coast. Coastal trade was dominant because the technology wasn't there for going far out to sea, as we've talked about before in this class. So traders stayed close to the coastline, and they traded, as I said, largely in two separate spheres. One was the European side of Eurasia was trading with the west coast of South Asia and the kingdoms that were located there, and the east coast of South Asia, of the Indian subcontinent, was trading with Southeast Asia and up into China. Trade goods would come out of the Arabian Peninsula, make their way over to the Indian subcontinent and the Indian traders, and then they would be passed on to Malay traders, and then later Arab traders would make their way all the way over to the Indian Ocean and also into South China. But usually these were two separate spheres in very early period. So we look back to the Roman period we talked about early on in the class. They were trading, many times they were trading out of Egypt, and they would trade with the Chera kingdom in southern India. And that trade goes from a very early period. You can look from the 3rd to the 2nd century BCE. And that continued on up until the medieval period, really, in Western history. South Asian kingdoms such as the Chola and the Pandya kingdoms are the ones that kind of made the Indian Ocean trade network much more expansive, and so we'll talk more about that. Particularly the Chola kingdom, located in the Tamil area, the southern Indian region, became a very important connection between Southeast Asian and East Asian traders, meaning China and all the Southeast Asian kingdoms, and carrying their goods out of China, but also bringing in goods that became luxury commodities for elites that lived in the different Chinese dynasties and also the different Southeast Asian kingdoms. So the kingdom, the Chola kingdom, and then later the Pandya kingdom were important because they were much larger and they were connected this huge maritime network. They had large fleets of boats. The rulers of these kingdoms were very supportive of trade, just like the other kings that we've talked about or other rulers we've talked about in this class who found their power from economic authority as well as political authority. And the things that they traded in included large numbers of different spices, cardamom coming mostly from the west, cinnamon, cloves, turmeric is coming from South Asia, cloth, silks coming from China, ivory, which is coming both from Asia, but also, as we learned from the film on Zhenghe, is coming from East Africa, and tortoise shells. And you can see in this map the largest extent of control that the Chola kingdom had across the Indian Ocean. So again, this is the easternmost half of the Indian Ocean network, and the Chola kingdom, which was located in southern India, controlled quite a lot of territory, but their influence was even greater because of their trade power. So they extended all the way down the Malaccan Strait. You can see down here in the bottom corner, the right corner of the map, and then traders that made their way up to India, they passed through the region that the Chola kingdom controlled. I would ask you in class what other maritime rulers ruled over the area where the Chola kingdom had influence, but I'll answer that for you. That was the Srivijayan rulers. So Srivijaya in this part of Malaysia, the kind of the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, had been the Srivijayan maritime empire, and they're the ones who were the constant competitors with the Chola rulers. So in the same period of time that China is receiving tribute from the Srivijayan rulers, they're receiving tribute from the Chola rulers as well. And they were constantly feuding with each other and sometimes misrepresenting who they were when they went to the Chinese court, claiming to be each other's envoys, or taking credit for trade goods that they seized from one another and brought to the Chinese court and calling them their native products. So it was a great trade competition between the Chola Empire and the Srivijayan Empire. And this is going on all the way up through the 11th century into the 12th century. Now, the trade changed dramatically in that period, going from coastal trade primarily to high seas trade where traders were able to move out beyond the coastline, beyond sight of land, and travel across great distances because the technology was available, which I'll talk about in a moment. So when that happened, We found the kind of southern sea route that was taken by way of India started off in the Persian Gulf and traveled south across the Indian Ocean to India and then on to Sri Lanka, then through the Malaccan Strait, along the tip of Malaysia, past modern Singapore, and up the coast to mainland Southeast Asia. That would include the southern coast of what is now Vietnam, but at that time was Champa, and then on to the southern ports of China. So the Chinese end of this trade route opened up in the 2nd century CE, but it really did not become important until the 7th century, and did not become as active until the 7th century, when Arab traders began to make their way all the way across the Indian Ocean up to the Chinese ports, and actually took up residence inside of the Chinese ports and became regular contributors to trade across that entire region, bringing goods that the Chinese had not known of earlier. Spices coming from the Persian Gulf region, things like frankincense and myrrh, certain types of dyes used for dyeing textiles. The Arabs brought those in, and that became an important connection for the Chinese markets that wanted to have access to these goods. Later on, when the Portuguese, the Dutch, and Europeans arrive, they're going to follow the same routes that those earlier traders had already established a century before, even a millennia before they arrived. And so you'll find the Europeans, although claiming to be, as I've talked about before, claiming to enter into uncharted territory and seeing their exploits as being quite unique, were in fact just following the existing trade routes that had been established by these earlier non-European merchants that had come across the Indian Ocean in a much earlier time. So what happened? Why was that possible? Well, it was because of the technology that was made available. Sort of the largest, most important of these changes was the introduction of the compass. And the compass is an instrument that was has been claimed to have been invented in China quite early. There's evidence in writing that experiments with magnetism and the use of magnetism to find directional paths goes back to 240 BCE. So we have some very early references, but the first instrument known as a compass is described in the writing of the Northern Song scholar who was really one of the early scientists of China, Shen Guo. Shen Guo describes a compass as an instrument for determining direction in some of his writing, and soon thereafter we see compasses being developed to use at sea for navigational purposes. Other important inventions included the building of lighthouses, which I think we talked about in class, the setting up of fire beacons off of reefs, places that were dangerous for ships to pass by. They would be marked with these beacons, with these lighthouses, and the establishments of these sites all the way across the Indian Ocean eventually would become a feature of the trade network, sort of the established routes that people took. And the fact they could use compasses, you could chart a course that went well out to sea and not fear that you were going to get lost forever out in the oceans. There's another compass below the top picture, which is the more conventional compass, which in Chinese terms always had 24 different directions. So all of these separate characters you can see around the edge of the upper image are the different directions that were followed on the course. So that was how the compass was used, not referring to the 4 cardinal directions, but generally referring to these different points here on the compass. And below there's another compass that's was made from a magnetized spoon that would point towards true north. But this type of compass was generally not used for navigation. This is more for divination purposes, used by geomancers, Taoists who are practicing feng shui, the geomancy or the kind of Taoist practice of aligning things in a certain way. So these trade routes, these overseas trade routes, long distance trade expanded, and we can see this depicts the trade in a slightly later period, sort of the late imperial period. But you can see the different goods that are coming from different places along the Indian Ocean network that would be traded one after another across the region from east to west, and then from west to east, goods that were brought back from the Arabian Peninsula and back to East Asia were also equally valuable. So you can see a number of even goods that made their way down to Arabia via the Mediterranean coming from Europe were also extremely valuable. Now, eventually, Europeans are going to gain access to this trade market, particularly in the Mediterranean region, and this is where, along with Marco Polo's description of the fabulous riches of the East, this is where European rulers and their merchant emissaries become greatly interested in trying to get into Southeast Asia too, to gain access to these goods. But in an earlier period, much of this trade was going on between East Asia, China, and the rest of East Asia, and Southeast Asia, and then on to India, and then on to the Arab region. So that was something that was a long-standing trade that was going on throughout this period. Some of the great traders we've talked about on overland routes included the Sogdians, the Uyghurs. We talked about their role as intermediaries. At sea, the Bugis were some of the great sailor traders, and in other seasons would also would engage in piracy if trade was in peril. The Bugis were the great traders through the center of the seas between the Spice Islands and the main islands of what's now Indonesia and Malaysia. The Bugis lived in along the series of an archipelago of islands in that region, and the major island in which they were and still are an indigenous people is Sulawesi, or the Celebes, and this style of rig for their boats are still seen on the seas around Indonesia. This lantine sail, a sail that wasn't fixed, so you had to constantly be blown with the wind, but instead you could pull in the sail and get closer to where the wind was coming from, allowed them to be able to expertly navigate around very shallow waters with very light winds, and so they were considered to be master sailors and great sea merchants for that reason. And because of their great maritime skills, they also made for great pirates because they knew where to hide should anyone be sending out a naval armada to look for them later, as the British did when the British come into the region. They feared the Bugis because they were fearsome fighters, but also they were very cunning in their ability to evade people who were trying to find them. And so this is where the term the boogeyman comes from, in kind of the English popular imagination, because of the skills and the kind of reputation that the Bugis had when they were encountering these Europeans. So they remain a non-state people in modern day Indonesia, meaning they are indigenous to these island areas, but they don't have much or have not been engaged much with lowland society and kind of been incorporated. They've mostly been marginalized. So we can think about other non-state peoples in Southeast Asia, include the Hmong people, or in China the same people are known as the Miao. People who live in the upland area, mountain areas, and are separate from the lowland people who are dominating government. The Bugis are outside of that, and so they're considered to be non-state actors in that way. They were wet rice cultivators, so like the Balinese people in Bali and Chinese communities, they cultivated rice, but they never controlled huge areas of particular territories. They were not political elite. They were always apart from that and kind of stayed outside. So they stayed relevant within the political order by allying themselves with stronger powers, either local governments, or when the Europeans eventually arrive, they're going to ally themselves with one set of Europeans or another, or fight off the Europeans in the case of the British. And so their skill at playing people off each other was one way of that they survived politically throughout this region. They were mostly located in, as I said, island areas and river at the mouths of rivers where they set their villages. So goods that came down from the interior of the islands, from the upland areas, came down the rivers, and they would collect those goods and trade them by sea to other places. Other parts of, you can see here, the kind of Bugi homeland area here, southern Sulawesi. Here's the island of Sumatra, Borneo, and Sulawesi is here in that southern area. In green is their home region within Indonesia today. So there were kind of three, if you think about it, the region that they traveled through and the three corners of the kind of colonial period Bugi trading activities extended from Manila, that the Spanish controlled eventually because the Philippines would become a Spanish colony. Batavia, which was going to be modern-day Jakarta, which is going to be Indonesia, that the Dutch eventually are going to control. And Malacca, which by the time the Bugis are most active in the 17th and late 17th and 18th century, the British are controlling Malacca by that point. But the 18th century is considered to be the Bugi century within maritime Southeast Asia because of their influence, their trading reputation and their sort of influence. Although they didn't control, as I said, any great political territory, they had influence over others because they're great traders. And so from the period up to from about 722 up until the 19th century, you see the Bugis being a very important and very active traders within this network. After that point, the Dutch, who have taken over Indonesia and renamed it the Dutch East Indies, and Malay forces that are coming out of British Malaya, which would be the Malay Peninsula, they eventually defeat the Bugis and sort of force them back into a very subservient status within this, and they no longer are a big part of the trade network. But in this earlier period, the Bugis are important agents for trade, just like the Sogdians were overland in the Tang Dynasty and before, and the way the Uyghurs were in the northwest corner of modern-day China. So you can see that island Southeast Asia is a number of different peoples lived within this area. Sumatra had a large after the fall of the Srivijayan kingdom, the Majapahit Empire was formed, and after the fall of Majapahit, there were several other maritime kingdoms that were formed in this area. But I'll talk now about the existing traders there, and then the arrival of Islam, the kind of the transformation of this region under Islamic leadership as one ruler after another converted from being an indigenous ruler following indigenous practices to taking the title of sultan and serving as an Islamic kind of a faithful follower of Islam and also of the political authority for the region. The Sunda, this is at the tip of the islands in Java. We can find in the area of West Sunda, there's kind of this boundary, these very, very distinctive monolithic tombs that were megalithic tombs, these huge tombs that were built in this region. And it was a definition of the local culture of the area that these tombs were established as sort of places where people, the living, lived among the dead around these areas, and they kind of define the villages of this region. So this is pre-Islam. This is going back to prehistory up until the very early period. This type of monolithic or megalithic culture developed in this part of Southeast Asia and kind of defined local society. Then we have the arrival into this area of Java of Vedic culture, Indian, ancient Indic culture, in the form of the worship of Shiva, of Vishnu, that we had seen in the last lecture that I gave, but also the arrival of certain literary epics such as the Ramayana and Mahabharata, certain epic poems that told stories of great heroes from the North Indian region where the Vedic tradition began. And these practices and these stories spread into Java and then into other parts of Southeast Asia and were incorporated into local life. So you can see here from central Java in the early 10th century a frieze of this sculpture that was done from scenes from the epic story of Prince Rama here, the Ramayana. And certain texts were also passed into this area, brought into for the teachings on Hinduism, Buddhism, and Hindu Buddhism. As we kind of merged these two practices together, they came into the region. These were all painted on and printed onto palm leaves, onto dried palm leaves, which was a widespread practice. And I think earlier when we talked about the sutras, the teachings of Buddhism, that Xuanzang, the monk who left Tang Taizong's court, the early Tang court, and went to North India to get the teachings of Buddhism, they also were printed on palm leaves. They were written on palm leaves, so it was quite common for that. So we find evidence of that down here in this section of island Southeast Asia too, where these practices were brought and then transformed local religious practice and local cultural practice. While in that early period of time, the islands to the north east of Java in this section of Indonesia, these are the islands, the Spice Islands, that are going to be getting all that attention later on from people seeking the valuable commodities that come from this region. And so this is just a close-up of that map that I've showed several times before, this region, but you can see close up there's an archipelago of many, many islands, and they all in the end cultivate different spices. So that the cloves are coming from here, from Tidore in particular. You can find these tiny islands that are cultivating spices here in the Molucca Sea. The Banda Islands are not even depicted here because even at this great detail, the Banda archipelago is still quite tiny. But this is where nutmeg and spice mace, nutmeg and mace, were indigenous and was the only place in the world where they could be found. So really, it's quite amazing that these spices that are going to have a huge global impact come from such tiny places within island Southeast Asia. And so these places were hidden from the rest of the traders, as I've said many times. So traders farther to the west didn't know where the islands were, but they took the trade anyway, and then they claimed to have the kind of to others further west, or to the Chinese traders that came south, they claimed to have the only access you could get to these islands. So they tried to hide the existence of the islands, and the inhabitants of the islands tried to hide their existence as well, because they had this monopoly going on. Well, Arab traders, as I mentioned earlier, are going to be the ones who make this into a larger network of trade. And so they begin to spread between the 7th and 9th centuries. And the main flow of trade in the very beginning was the bringing in of gold and silver, gold in particular, from the Persian Gulf area to South Asia. And they received pepper and other manufactured goods that were brought over from Southeast Asia and from East Asia. And before and this is pre-Islamic Arab trade. So before kind of Muslim conquests began, you begin to see the Indian Ocean trade is very much indirect, and it was conducted mostly by local merchants that were trading in their local area. So the trade between India and the Persian Gulf region was primarily the primary maritime connections that were made in that time. But eventually, Arab traders are going to expand across into Southeast Asia, as they had gone up into Central Asia and done the overland Silk Road route all the way across to Western China. So it really was the expansiveness of Arab merchants, of Arab maritime traders, that kind of pushed the Indian Ocean trade network to expand further and further, and then to connect up the two halves that intersected on the Indian subcontinent, to connect those two halves together. Largely, it was the work of Arab traders that did that. The goods traded by Arabs included horses, a very important commodity, as was noted in the Zheng He movie as well. Sugar is also brought in from South Asia. Black pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, frankincense, and myrrh coming from the Persian Gulf region. Balsam, cardamom also coming largely from North Africa or coming from the Persian Gulf region. Dill, the spice or the herb itself, then was spread. Cotton, which comes in from South Asia, actually comes from the Mesopotamia originally, and then makes its way over to South Asia. And indigo dye, which was a dye that the Indian textiles use quite a lot, and also becomes very important in Chinese textiles later on. So Arab traders first brought the teachings of Islam to the Malay Peninsula from India, and then it was spread throughout the Indonesian archipelago. Islam was initially introduced towards the end of the 13th century. So people had already converted to Islam in an earlier period, and Arabs certainly had converted to Islam in an earlier period. This can only really be explained by the fact that many of the Arab traders, up until this point, were mostly passing through the region that's Southeast Asia, island Southeast Asia, to get to the Chinese markets. So the Chinese markets and the South China coast actually had a larger Arab community at an earlier time than Southeast Asia would. And so there were certain areas around the South China coast, there were large communities of Arab merchants living there. Chinese society and the Chinese court accepted the presence of these traders, as well as they established mosques in this area as well in that time. But the southwest Chinese coast did not see a widespread expansion of Islam, of communities converting to Islam. Like Muslim communities didn't expand. They were the Muslim practitioners in that area in, say, from the 10th, 11th, and 12th century were primarily Arab and foreign merchants themselves. They weren't indigenous Han Chinese converts. What happens in the 13th century in Southeast Asia is that indigenous people convert to Islam because it, as we've talked about many times in this class, and go back to the Bentley chapter, it kind of gave the ability to engage more closely in these commercial networks that they wanted to participate in, and to gain the trust of the traders themselves if they were dealing with people who had similar feelings, similar religious convictions. So that this was something that eventually in the 13th century you see more and more traders in Southeast Asia, and then the elite themselves who want to engage in trade with these Arab traders, you see them converting to Islam as a dominant religion. The kings of the spice-producing islands of the Banda Sea, where nutmeg and mace are coming from, all became Muslims by the mid-15th century. So Islam had made its way all the way across there into this region by that point. And you can see much of the area that had once been Hindu-Buddhist in an earlier period would convert to Islam in a later period. So we can see this map depicts the spread of Islam throughout island Southeast Asia, and gives you the different time frame. It's really through the 17th and 18th century that we see the kind of final expansion of Islam into what is modern-day Indonesia and modern-day Malaysia, and also including Brunei on this island of Borneo which is now a separate state, but that it's ruled by a sultan that had converted in this period of time to Islam as well. The southern islands of the Philippines also converted, so that communities in the southern islands of Mindanao are also Muslim, whereas the northern islands, after the Spanish conquest, had adopted Catholicism, but they had also retained native beliefs. So it was a merging of native beliefs and Christian beliefs from outside that becomes dominant in the northern islands of the Philippines. So the great maritime, first great Muslim maritime empire starts with the Aceh Sultanate in 1496. The conversion of the ruler of Aceh to Islam, and then and the building of the great mosque there marked the beginning of their ascent as a Muslim power, economic power. They also exercised control over the Malacca here. This is the port that had been dominated by had Chinese domination when Zheng He's voyages in the early part of the 15th century had passed through, and when Zheng He had patronized, or his crew had patronized and supported a particular ruler to become the ruler over that over Malacca. Soon thereafter, Malacca will also become a sultanate, and the ruler will convert to Islam. So the Chinese influence continued, but it waned somewhat when Aceh became more powerful by the end of the century and began to exercise power throughout this region too. This is, again, due to trade, because you can see the Malaccan Strait being this very important east to west across the Indian Ocean into the South China Sea, a very important conduit, a very important passageway for traders to pass through going in either direction. Anyone who controlled either side of this coast could demand a levy on those who were passing through and get a portion of their trade. Or people would land there and trade at these markets along the way. So this became a very important source for political and also economic power for these people. And Banda Aceh, this is the great mosque that was built in the sign of their economic, religious, and political authority that was established. So we can see in this early period of Indian Ocean trade, there's a connection between East and West that met at the Indian subcontinent. That's the very first point, when it was still coastal trade that was dominant, and then later on, maritime empires begin to form. Some in India, some in Southeast Asia. They engage in trade and begin to trade and compete with each other back and forth across the Indian Ocean. And then we see the role of Arab traders coming into the region, expanding their influence, and then becoming important political influence and also religious influence on the rulers of Southeast Asia. And this great mosque is an indicator of the rise of Islam as an important feature of island Southeast Asian life. That's going to be the topic of the film that you're going to see for this week. So please think about these ideas in the background when you watch the film and answer the film questions. If you have any questions for me, please let me know via email, and I will respond to those questions as soon as I can. Please also remember that your paper is due on April 11th, which I outlined in the email that I sent to you earlier last week. And please let me know if you have any questions about that. Thank you very much.